I'll resume once again. Yes. So the recording has started. So I think you people can see it, the whiteboard. Can everyone see the whiteboard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So major questions in macroeconomics. Okay. So this what we discussed in our last class. So we will carry the discussion further today. So if you remember, time is an important aspect when we discuss about anything in economics. So you remember that we discussed about long run and short run in microeconomics. Remember, in production cost, also in perfect competition. Okay. So what was the assumption in short run? That one of the factors is fixed. So this led to what? This led to law of variable proportions. Remember, law of variable proportions. Now, when we talked about long run, all factors were variable, and that led to what we spoke about, returns to scale. Okay, so this is what we discussed in microeconomics. In macroeconomics also, when we discuss in macroeconomics, so one of the factors, just a minute, so one of the factors is fixed. I need to rewrite it once again. So this lead to I think, okay, I have to just get a new. Hang on, so I have to open it once again. Yeah. So here, if I talk about in disturbing, just a minute, give me some time. Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when we talk about long run and short run, okay. So this is our long run and short run. So we already discussed in micro about long run, short run. Short run, one of the factors is fixed. So this led to law of variable proportions. In the long run, all factors are variable. Okay, all factors are variable. So this led to this concept of returns to scale. Okay. Now, in macro also, we have similar such concept, that is long run and short run. So in long run, what is happening? Long run, we assume that all the prices are flexible. Okay. Whereas in short run, the prices are fixed. That means the prices are sticky. They don't change easily in the short run. So when prices are flexible in the long run, we get something which is known as the long run aggregate supply curve, or LRAS curve, which we will discuss in the course of time. Similarly, in the short run, when prices are fixed or sticky, we get short run aggregate supply curve. So you see that there are certain concepts which are used both in micro and macroeconomics, and they have their own implications depending on in which discipline we are discussing this timeline. Okay. Now, one more issue that comes up in macroeconomics vis-a-vis that of microeconomics is the aggregation problem. So if you remember the aggregation problem, so when we discussed about either demand, okay, when we discussed about either demand or production, so we discussed first about the individual demand, and then we also discussed about individual supply, that is supply by an individual firm. And when we went to the market demand or the market supply, what did we do? We just aggregated all the individual demand or supply curves to get the market demand or supply curves. Remember from your microeconomics. So when we spoke about the market demand or market supply curve, we actually aggregated all the individual demand and the individual supply curves. But this is not possible. This simple aggregation rule is not possible in case of macroeconomics. So when we talk about macroeconomics, if you'd like to find that what is the the aggregate consumption or aggregate investment or aggregate savings, we will not get that figure or that number by simply adding up some individual supply or individual investment or individual consumption, individual savings. Because what is happening, the basic premise of macroeconomics is this, that here 2 plus 2 does not necessarily lead to 4. It can be greater than 4, it can be less than 4. And why does it happen? Because of the interaction effect. Because of interaction effect of individual players. Interaction effect of individual players that leads to this aggregation problem in macroeconomics, and which you can also say that there is some sort of externality effect involved. So you learn about what is this externality effect in microeconomics. I think you may have learned or you will be learning it. So interaction effect of individual players leads to this aggregation problem, So whereby in macroeconomics, we don't get something like 2 plus 2 equal to 4. It can be either greater than 4 or it can be less than 4. Only in very rare case, it becomes equal to 4. It's a very rare case. Okay. So these are some of the distinctions which we have between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, how did this origin? So what is the origin of this macroeconomics? Okay. How did this discipline of macroeconomics actually come to the fore? So by now, I think you might have heard about a person who is known as Adam Smith. Can you tell me what is the famous phrase associated with this person, Adam Smith? Does anyone know? Tridit? Tridit?
Sir, I know the book name which he wrote.
So what is the name of the book?
Sir, an inquiry into the wealth of nations, nature of the wealth of nations.
Achha. So, and what was the famous phrase that he coined?
Sir, I don't remember, sir.
Do you remember now? Do you remember now?
Oh, sorry, yes. Like Adam Smith, like he suggested that there should
yeah, and now I'm carrying the discussion. Now I'm carrying the discussion.
Yes, sir.
So invisible hand. So what did Adam Smith say? That every individual will pursue self-interest. Okay, every individual will pursue self-interest. Now, when there will be thousands of such individuals, then what will happen? Then what is going to happen when there will be thousands of such individuals? Then some coordination will happen. Some coordination of self-pursuits of these individuals in absence of any government intervention. That means government is following a policy of what? Laissez-faire. So this is another French phrase which is being used, laissez-faire. So when government follows a policy of laissez-faire, that means no intervention in the pursuits of these individuals. It will lead to what? It will lead to outcome of maximum social welfare of all. Okay. So maximum social welfare of all. So you can say Adam Smith is somewhat considered as the father of capitalism. So when thousands of such individuals are pursuing the self-interest, then their self-interest will be coordinated by this invisible hand. And what is this invisible hand? This invisible hand is nothing but your market mechanism, free market mechanism. This free market mechanism, which is nothing but this invisible hand, will coordinate that. Then this chaotic condition, coordination of this chaotic condition will lead to spontaneous order of market. And when this spontaneous order of market happens, what happens? You get all the desired goods and services at desired prices and quantity. So this is what happens. Okay. So desired quantity at desired prices and quantity, you get all this goods and services, which leads to maximum social welfare. So this was basically being propounded by Adam Smith. Now, following Adam Smith came one more economist who is also known as one of the forerunners of classical economic thought, that is Jean Baptiste Say. Okay, so Jean Baptiste Say was the another pioneer thinker in this macroeconomic thought process. So what does Jean Baptiste say? So there is a very famous saying of Jean Baptiste, so which is known as Say's law. And what is Say's law? Supply creates its own demand. So supply is creating its own demand. Fine. Now when supply is creating its own demand, what does it mean? That there will be no excess supply. Now, how does that happen? Let's say Tridit is a farmer. Okay. So apart from pursuing taekwondo, Tridit also cultivates crops. And that leads to, and Tridit produces what? Paddy, which is converted to rice. Now, Tridit produces paddy both for self-consumption and for market, okay, selling purpose. Now, self-consumption is something which Tridit always needs to produce to sustain himself. But market, that is selling in the market, is something which Tridit does to gain resources for his other needs. So what are his other needs? It can be anything. It can be other food items. It can be grocery. It can be something like let's say some consumer goods. Okay. It can be consumer goods, etc., etc. Now see, excluding the self-consumption part, whatever Tridit is supplying, excluding the self-consumption part, what is Tridit is supplying, that is what is Tridit is producing, that is the portion which is allocating or earmarking for market, is actually an excess supply over and above his demand, own demand. But this excess supply, you now see, is doing what? This excess supply is now creating demand for other food items and consumer goods. Okay. So now Tridit creates a demand for food, other food and consumer goods. Now what happens next? Now let us see. So now there is excess demand for other foods and consumer goods. So now, like Tridit, there is one more person who now supplies. Who is that? Let's say that is Pinva. Okay. So Pinva is now producing these other consumer goods. So Pinva produces some for himself and some for selling in the market. And when he sells in the market, why is Pinva selling in the market? Because Pinva has demand for paddy. So whether you have a barter economy or money-based exchange system, whatever Pinva is producing for selling in the market creates a demand for the excess supply of paddy created by Tridit and vice versa. So whatever excess supply of consumer goods is being created by Pinva is being consumed through, is being demanded by Tridit. So now you see that Say's law is basically stressing on this fact that whatever supply you are creating through production of your own goods, it is creating demand for other goods and services in the market. Yes or no? Vidit,
Yes, sir.
understood?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, this is what is this basic tenet of what we term as classical economics. Okay, Say's law is the basic tenet of classical economics. Now, there are other tenets also of classical economics. So, what are those tenets? Let us see. So, one more tenet of classical economics is what? Full employment. That means all factors of production are fully employed. Okay. So whatever unemployment you have got is totally what? Voluntary. So I'll give an example. So what do we mean by voluntary unemployment and involuntary unemployment? So voluntary means which you are doing out of your own choice. Let's say, I can give an example. Let's say Kevin, don't take it otherwise. Kevin makes a choice of not attending the class. So that's a voluntary choice. So Kevin made the choice of not attending the class. So that's a voluntary choice. Okay. But let's say, so he is not attending the class. So that's a voluntary absence. Now let us consider the example of, let's say, Sushana. Sushana wants to attend the class, but due to internet connectivity, Sushana cannot attend the class. So in case of Sushana, it is involuntary absence because Sushana wanted to, but because of barriers or some difficulties, Sushana could not attend the class. So similarly, when I am talking about voluntary employment, I mean whereby the labor force or that section of the labor force are not employed because of their choice. Okay. So we know that full employment is what? All factors of production are fully employed, and employment, that is labor employment, is a function of real wage rate. Okay. Labor employment is a function of real wage rate. How do we calculate real wage rate? Nominal wage rate W divided by the price level. This gives me the real wage rate. Okay. So there are two important variables in calculating real wage rate, that is wage rate, which is a nominal wage rate, and the price level. So W by P gives me the real wage rate. Now, in a market, there will be labor force who is supplying labor, and there will be producers who will be demanding labor. Okay. Now, as I've already mentioned, employment is a function of real wage rate. That means labor supply is a function of real wage rate. Higher the real wage rate, higher the labor supply, lower the real wage rate, lower the labor supply. Okay. Now, what happens? Similarly, if you look in case of our labor demand, so demand is what? Demand is a function of marginal productivity. If you remember that marginal product of labor curve, which was downward sloping. Okay, marginal product of labor curve, which was downward sloping. MRPL, marginal revenue product of labor curve. So it was MRPL curve. Remember that MRPL curve, marginal product multiplied by the price. So intersection of this gives me the equilibrium, real wage rate, and the equilibrium level of employment. So at that point, so if I draw here, so this is my labor demand curve and this is my labor supply curve. So here I measure the real wage rate, here I measure the labor employment. So this gives me what? Equilibrium employment of labor, and this gives me what? Equilibrium wage rate. So at this point, labor demand is equal to labor supply, and the corresponding labor supply produces an output which gives me the full employment output. Okay. So any equilibrium that is happening in case of classical economics, which is a full employment economy. Okay. Employment and output, they go hand in hand. Okay. So more employment, more output, less employment, less output, and in case of full employment, that means whatever labor is being demanded at equilibrium wage rate is being supplied by the labor force, we get the output which is the potential, output level. So which is the potential output level. So this is the maximum possible. Usually this is the capacity. This is the output capacity in the economy, which is a function of prevailing technology. So the level of technology will determine, subject to full employment, what is the potential output. So full employment leads to potential output in the economy, which is defined by classical economic theory. Okay. So that's what we have to discuss about this classical economic theory. But what happened? This Say's law and all this classical economics, full employment thing, which we discussed so much, will now be in 1929. There was this Great Depression. So in Great Depression, what happened? There was huge unemployment. Huge unemployment happened. There was fall in production. And which stressed the failure of classical economics. Okay. So the failure of classical economics happened. And why it happened, this failure of classical economics? Let us see. So what did this classical economics say? Classical economics said one more thing, that if there is some disequilibrium, in employment, then through wage price flexibility, or through interest rate flexibility, economics will always return to full employment. Okay. Economics will always return to full employment. So what did this mean? That means, let's say, at a given wage rate, real wage rate. So let's say the real wage rate is very high. So when the real wage rate is very high, what will happen? real wage rate very high. So your labor supply, will also increase. But we have seen in our discussion on factor markets, labor demand is a inverse function of real wage rate. So higher the real wage rate, labor demand will fall. Lower the real wage rate, labor demand will rise. So when there is high real wage rate, what will happen? Demand for labor falls. So now there is what? Excess supply of labor. Okay. So there is now excess supply of labor, and when there is excess supply of labor, what will happen? That means there will be unemployment. Temporary unemployment will happen. So when temporary unemployment happens, what will happen? There will be fall in income, because of unemployment there will be lesser income in the hands of people. And when there is fall in income, what will happen? There will be fall in demand. And as there is fall in demand, what will happen? There will be fall in prices. Okay. So there is excess demand, and following this excess demand, there is excess supply of labor. So there is excess supply of labor, and compared to the demand. So because of that, there will be unemployment, and because of unemployment, there will be fall in income one way, and there will be fall in demand. So when there is fall in demand, what is happening? So excess supply of labor, unemployment. So now there will be fall in demand is happening. So there fall in prices is also happening. So now this is happening in one way. Now in the other sector, what is happening is this, that as there is this fall in this prices, there will also be fall in your wages. Okay. So that means in this W by P, both W is falling as well as P is falling. Okay. But what will happen in this case, that compared to the fall in P, the fall in W will be much more steeper. That means W will fall more drastically compared to fall in P. So what will happen overall? Overall, the W by P will start falling. Okay. So once this W by P starts falling, what will happen? Demand will again start rising, and supply will concomitantly start falling. So this gap, this excess supply of labor, will also fall till it reaches a point where labor demand is equal to labor supply. That means we again reach that point that whatever is demanded at a given real wage rate will be supplied. So again we reach this full employment. So once we reach this full employment, again what will happen? Again the economy will reach the potential output level. Okay. So that means it will reach the full capacity, full production capacity. Okay. Full production capacity. So that's how the adjustment happens. So if there is any disequilibrium because of this higher real wage rate, when there is excess supply of labor over demand, then through this wage price flexibility, there will be fall in the real wage rate, such that what will happen, that your excess supply of labor will fall, which will lead to again equilibrium of demand and supply, following which there will be full employment, and again the economy will reach its potential output or the full production capacity level, and there the unemployment will be eliminated. But in Great Depression, this mechanism did not work. This wage price mechanism of this wage price flexibility failed to work. Okay, so they failed to work. That's why there was continuous fall in production, continuous fall in continuous rise in unemployment. But this wage price flexibility did not work. So the gap between labor demand and labor supply only kept on increasing. Okay. So now what will happen? So now, so this fall in prices, one more thing which I need to add. So this fall in prices will now again lead to increase in demand. Okay. One thing which I missed out. So this fall in prices will lead to increase in demand, which will again lead to increase in demand for your labor, and then this gap will keep on right. So when this W by P, that means what is happening, this P is also falling, but this increase in demand for goods is also happening, increase in demand for goods. So when increase in demand for goods happens, again the demand for labor will start rising. Okay. So again there is excess supply. So this is how this mechanism works. Now, as I said that this mechanism failed to work in 1929 during Great Depression. Then what happened? Then one more person came in the scene who is known by the name of John Maynard Keynes. Okay. So he is also one of the founding fathers of IMF. So he is associated with the founding of this IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, which started with, if you remember, I think you people have studied, Bretton Woods conference, which happened at the end of what? So when did Bretton Woods conference happen, Tridit? Tridit, when the Bretton Woods conference happened?
Sir, I don't know.
Fantastic. At the end of Second World War. Okay. So Keynes criticized this classical economic thought. So Keynes criticized this classical economic thought. Okay. Now, what he said. So what we remember is in classical thought we said that output is a function of level of employment. Okay, which is again function of what? Real wage rate. That means it is translating to what? Output is a function of real wage rate. Fine. But what Keynes actually said is this, that Keynes actually said that output level in the economy is a function of aggregate effective demand. Now see, this is the fundamentally two competing thoughts of macroeconomic thoughts. One is your classical vis-a-vis Keynes. So classical people said output is a function of real wage rate, which is derived, which is nothing but an extension of the thought that supply creates its own demand. Whereas Keynes says that output is a function of aggregate effective demand. So to explain this, this Great Depression, Keynes came with his theory. Okay. So which is known famously as the general theory of output, income, and employment. So Keynes being a famous, so it is actually from Keynes that economists started studying macroeconomics as an independent subject. Okay. So Keynes is, you can say Keynes is nothing but father of macroeconomics. Okay. So he actually gave a definite shape and structure to this study of macroeconomics. So what did Keynes actually mean that output is a function of aggregate effective demand? So he's saying that during Great Depression, what actually happened? During Great Depression, so post-war, first, Second World War, there was increase in productive capacity of the economy. So more labor was supplied, more better technology was introduced that led to more output. Okay, more output. But what happened towards late 1920s? Towards late 1920s, demand was not matching up to supply. That means there was excess supply over demand. Okay. Now, as there was excess supply over demand, what happens? So there is piling up of goods. So when there is piling up of goods, what will happen? You will reduce your production because you need to clear this piling up of goods which are being, which is as a result, which is happening as a result of excess supply. So you'll reduce your production. So when you reduce the production, what will happen? So when you increase or expand your productive activity, there is increase in investment. So you expand your plant, you expand your machinery, you expand your other production activities. So there is increase in investment demand when you increase production. But when you reduce production, what will happen? There will be reduction in investment. So two things happened. So demand fell because of what? Demand fell because of reduction in consumption demand. Okay. And reduction in what? Investment demand. So because of this reduction in consumption demand and reduction in investment demand, there was what? There was fall in aggregate effective demand. So there was fall in this aggregate effective demand. So as there is fall in this aggregate effective demand, what happened? So the demand, so this demand for labor also fell. Okay, demand for labor fell. So which led to increase in unemployment. So increase in unemployment as there was already an excess supply of goods. So it led to further fall in demand for goods. So further fall in demand for goods led to further fall in effective demand. And that's how output fell. And why did this thing happen? Because wage price flexibility did not work. Because of rigidity of both wage and price. Okay. So that's what Keynes actually came out with, an alternative thought, which is known as the Keynesian revolution, that output is a function of aggregate effective demand, and when there is deficit in this effective demand, then output will fall. Then how can you make output reach again this potential level, that is the full economic capacity of a full production capacity? You can make up for this deficit in aggregate demand by increasing government demand of goods and services. So this is where a big difference is happening between the classical economics and Keynesian economics. So classical economics always advocates against any government intervention, but Keynes says that to make up for this deficit in aggregate demand because of the explanations which are provided, the government needs to step in and make up for the deficit in this aggregate demand such that the output level increases and it again reaches the potential output level of the economy. Okay, so this is where, and how government can do it. Government can do by either by increasing its expenditure, or tax cuts. So when you cut taxes, what happens? More income, more disposable income comes in the hand of the people, so that leads to increase in more effective demand, and hence output again reaches this potential output level. And if government increases its expenditure, then what is happening? The government will increase the effective demand on its own directly, and that will also lead to increase in output, which will again lead to the economy to the potential output level. So basically, what Keynes actually said is this, that government should follow something which is known as an expansionary fiscal policy based on deficit budget. That means government should run a deficit in the budget where its expenditure is greater than its revenue. So this can happen either by keeping the revenue fixed and increasing expenditure, or by increasing the expenditure, or by keeping the expenditure fixed and decreasing its revenue, which is nothing but the tax collection through your tax cuts. So by following an expansionary fiscal policy, government can increase its effective output, which can help the economy to reach the potential output level, and again we can reach what? Full employment level. So Keynes actually gave an alternative to capitalism to make it viable when classical economic logic fails to work. So keep this thing very clearly in your mind, that Keynesian thought process is applicable only in case of capitalist or developed economies. It is never applicable in case of Indian economics, because we have not reached that potential output capacity. We have got a lot of structural deficiencies, which we'll study in your Indian economics, in your development economics and Indian economics next year. We have got a lot of structural deficiencies, because of which we cannot consider this full employment framework, and as we cannot consider this full employment framework, we cannot also consider the applicability of the Keynesian economics in the Indian context. Keynesian economics is only applicable in the developed economy or the capitalist economy. So we are yet to become a full-fledged capitalist economic system. Okay, so I end my discussion here today, and I hope that you have been able to pick up what I've discussed. Okay, so any questions, anyone? You can raise it now. Any questions, anyone? You can raise it now. Any questions, Suraj?
No, sir.
Tridit?
No, sir.
Pinbha? Acha. Cindy? No question. Sushana?
Sir.
Yes.
Oh, I don't have any question.
Okay, and Chadi? Chadi, any question?
Good, sir.
Okay.
No, sir. Not yet.
Today also I'm finding the same combination. All the girls present and only 7 boys present. So who are present today? Tokcham, Suraj, Mons Bhuite, Messi, Renben, Suraj, Tridit. Okay, fine. So I will send a video recording of this. Yeah, tell me.
Peter, they got a heavy rainfall in their area, so he's not getting a proper.
Okay. Fine. So only
class.
Peter is the has
And-
got issue. Okay, fine. So I'll send the
And-
recording and I also
yeah.
anyone else?
And one more, Shabrang, he went to get his
Who
friends,
else?
it seems.
Who?
Like, so he asked me to inform.
Who?
Shabrang.
Shafram, okay. So I stop here today. So we will continue the discussion tomorrow. Okay, and I'll send the recording as and when I receive it and upload the same on the YouTube. Okay. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
Same.